Peter Robbins is an investigative writer specialising in the subject of UFOs. He's had more than 35 years' experience as a writer, researcher, investigator, lecturer, and author. A regular fixture on radio shows in the US and in the UK. He's appeared as a guest on and been consultant to numerous TV programs and documentaries. Well, not long after the Roswell incident, the suspicious death of James Forrestal rocked American politics. Was it suicide or was he murdered? Peter has researched the topic of James Forrestal's death and the mystery surrounding his death for almost 3 decades. He's produced a documentary titled James Forrestal, His Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death, and that provides a thorough analysis of the days leading up to James Forrestal's demise. He joins us now. Peter, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be on with you.
I thought I'd start firstly with, and of course there's lots of questions surrounding James Forrestal's death, but firstly, who was he and why does he matter to history?
Yeah, that's the lead question for sure. James Forrestal was an extraordinary American, a true patriot, and how can I say, a man who in his life, public service came first. He was a very successful broker on Wall Street in the 1920s and into the 30s. At the invitation of the Roosevelt administration, as they were getting themselves out of the economic depression, he was invited to join a select group of very successful American businessmen, often referred to as the kitchen cabinet. A bit of a pun there, or the $1-a-year men, because in fact, for the time that they came to Washington and served at the pleasure of the president, they were paid a token sum of $1 a year. As the economy got better, literally all of these men returned to their private lives and continued to make money. James Forrestal did not. He stayed in Washington for the rest of his life to serve at the pleasure of 2 American presidents. He went on to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the pre-war. And then toward the end of the war, when the Secretary of Navy died of a heart attack, he became the Secretary of Navy. One of the things that distinguishes him as a public person was in that official capacity as a cabinet secretary, he did not remain at his desk in the Pentagon. He was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Tokyo Bay. He continued to put himself in harm's way, was an extraordinary team player, seemed to thrive in the high-stress atmosphere of Washington during the war. In April of 1945, President Roosevelt died. President Truman was sworn in. And after the war, Truman selected Forrestal to dismantle America's old War Department, which had been in place since the Revolutionary War, and create a new entity that became known as the Department of Defense. He could have chosen a gilt-edged committee of individuals, more than qualified to do it, but he selected this one man, and by all accounts, Forrestal did a brilliant job, and we have the legacy in terms of our modern military defense establishment here in the United States. In the spring of 1947, President nominated him to be the first Secretary of Defense. By acclamation, both houses of our Congress voted 100% with the president, and he was sworn in very suddenly in the second half of September of 1947. This is where the story kind of shifts gears. One of the things I present in the documentary is the extraordinary weight of responsibilities that fell on him and succeeding secretaries of defense. In essence, he became the second most powerful man in what we used to call the free world, and was charged directly by Truman with getting to the bottom of a mystery that had emerged less than 2 months earlier, with 2 events. On June 24th, the famous Kenneth Arnold UFO sightings over Washington State, and then a week later, the crash of an unknown object in the plains some miles from what was then a small town in New Mexico called Roswell. In studying Forrestal, whose life obsessed me on and off for some decades, two extraordinary, I'll call them character flaws emerged. One was that he seemed incapable of forging a truly deep, penetrating friendship with anyone. He had many friends. He was an extraordinarily charismatic individual, often described the way people used to describe President Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
He was the kind of person that when he walked into a room, be it an official event or a party, he was the one that attention centered on. He was the one, as they sometimes say, that all the guys wanted to have a drink with and all the women wanted to sleep with. And sleep with many of them he did. But very, again, like Kennedy, just so much intimacy,
Yeah.
not beyond. The other event, and I think it kind of really helped unwind him, sadly, was as an extraordinary achiever who came from very modest means. I chose this story in part because it has a ring of literature. It almost doesn't seem like he was real. And there's a very famous American novel from the 1920s called The Great Gatsby that was made into films twice, most recently with Leo DiCaprio in the starring role some years back. If F. Scott Fitzgerald had wanted to base Gatsby on a real person, it might as well have been James Forrestal. He had the habit of personalizing all of his professional and personal successes and failures. And with the most powerful defense establishment in history at his beck and call, after a year and a half at the job, he was unable to do anything really to discern the true nature of the truly anomalous UFO phenomena and what it represented in terms of its implications for humanity. Most of us who are hard workers and try to do our best, if we fail at something or don't meet our or the assigned goals that we've been given in life or work, we still actually or allegorically will go home that night, have dinner with the husband and wife or whomever, pet the dog, watch some television, and try to do a better job next day. With Mr. Forrestal, it ate him up inside. This coupled with the fact that he lost the president's confidence, sadly in part because powerful men around him who were somewhat jealous of Truman's closeness with Forrestal, spun a fabrication that he was disloyal. Not only was that not true, but here was a man who probably would have willingly died for the two presidents that he served. He was a true patriot and an extraordinarily public-spirited citizen. The fact was, he knew everything that Truman knew about the UFO phenomena. And unlike Truman, he was the one who was supposed to get to the bottom of it. If we're to believe the official account, whatever was building up inside him, that turmoil, really unwound literally the day that he stepped down as the first Secretary of State and the second Secretary of State came in. Within 24 hours, he had tried to commit suicide. He tried again. He was institutionalized at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in the state of Maryland, kept heavily sedated for 2 weeks, and then began to undergo treatment that would have been most appropriate in 1949 for deep depression, but especially so as a VIP patient at the hospital. After all, he was a former Secretary of Navy. I have seen the hospital records, or most of them. I've read every published account by everybody that visited him, read all the relevant newspaper coverage, and in every case, without exception, he was getting better. He was, his will to live had returned. He was responding to treatment well, and so much so that his brother one of his brothers arranged for him to be released from the hospital on Sunday, May 22nd of 1949, to complete his recovery at the estate of a well-to-do friend, which would have been most appropriate and probably just the right thing for him. But allegedly, he went into a completely unpredicted depression, found his room door open in the middle of the night, decided to hang himself or choke himself to death or jump out the window, or a combination of all three. And America the next morning learned the tragic news that officially the secretary had committed suicide. In this documentary, I, working with a little lawyer in my head for many years, present the case that he was murdered and then lay out the reasons why. It is a story for me that is a true American success story that flips toward the end into high Greek tragedy. The upshot of all of this is that James Forrestal, after a brief period of national mourning, was all but forgotten by the American public. And I dare say many of your listeners have never heard his name, unless perhaps they live in Princeton, New Jersey. He attended Princeton almost until graduation time, left 3 weeks before graduation to join the Navy and fight in World War I. The war ended, he went to Wall Street. And there is a Princeton campus named after him, a shopping center named after him. Also for Navy personnel and Navy veterans or families thereof, they may be aware that the very first nuclear aircraft carrier, christened in 1956, was the USS Forrestal. I have made it my job to reintroduce his name, to couple it with an awareness of the early days of the UFO cover-up, of which he was, for me, in part, most certainly a casualty. And I guess also in these trying times in this country, where words like patriot are bandied about very cheaply to remind Americans and anyone else what the real meaning of the world was. I hope people watch the documentary, and I hope they find some value in it.